Um, this presentation is based on a list of vascular plant species that have been generated during the two previous bioblitzes. And its main purpose is to help people who will be taking part in the upcoming bioblitz to identify the plants that they'll find in their survey plots. I have added a few species that were not on those lists, just to make the presentation a little more useful as an identification tool so that people could apply it to other forested areas in the Edmonton area, and of course, particularly the River Valley. In the interest of time, though, I'll try and concentrate mainly on those plants that are definitely known to occur in the forest. And I actually did a bit of a reconnaissance last Saturday, May 22nd, to see if I could confirm the presence of most of those species. And I did. I was able to confirm the majority. Of course, a lot are not flowering yet, but the vegetated parts are visible. This isn't a complete list. And at some point, I think we should probably try and create that list. It's also only of vascular plants, which means, of course, the trees, the shrubs, and the herbaceous plants, so not including the mosses and liverworts and lichens, which would be good to have in a full list. Just a word about identification. Pictures are a great help. Most of us, of course, start with pictures when we're trying to learn our plants, but they're not the whole story. And of course, the plants that you actually see during the survey may not look quite like some of these pictures. Experienced botanists tend to use keys as well as pictures. Keys involve examining the plant specimen, usually with magnification, a hand lens, or if you've got a dissecting scope, that's much easier, and choosing between alternative sets of statements about the plant. And the keys can be simple or complicated according to the plant group. So if you've got a genus with lots of species in it that are closely resemble each other, hard to distinguish, that will make for a complicated key, but it will probably get you to a more precise, correct identification in the end. And examples of in our flora with large numbers of species in the genus are the genus Carex, the sedges, and the willows. It's something like 113 species of sedge in Alberta and about 40 species of willow, but of course not all in this area, so I don't want to scare you off too much. But I do recommend that the best way of learning plants is to get out in the field, possibly with a guide, and really get to know them from sort of the moment they appear in the spring through till fruiting and senescence in the fall. And I would also recommend too that you use online sources. Wikipedia is really good for showing both images and providing text about most of our plants. So this first slide is of our two poplar trees. It's no surprise that they're both there because the aspen poplar and the balsam poplar are our commonest deciduous trees, with the aspen generally preferring the higher ground and the balsam poplar occupying the floodplains and the fringes of watercourses. Oh, I've suddenly appeared, that's surprising. Balsam poplar has extensively colonized the flat floodplain areas of the North Saskatchewan River, including Lady Flower Gardens Forest. Yes, it's very extensive in the bottom areas. I didn't notice really very huge trees, such as you see in the River Valley elsewhere. So I wasn't sort of completely conscious that it was old growth, but certainly there's mature trees there. I tried to, on my visit on Saturday, I tried to interpret the forest a bit, and I decided that there were sort of three fairly distinct plant communities. One I'm calling the bottomland, so that sort of corresponds to the floodplain with an elevation of about 610 meters. And that has mainly a canopy of balsam poplar and Manitoba maple, which is very, very abundant in the area. And at least one area of fairly uniform white spruce, which I was pleased because that will produce a different flora, but also rather surprised to find. Although, of course, white spruce is common in the ravines in the river valley and mixed in with deciduous poplars along the shores. And then I thought that the flora of the upland slopes, which would include a lot of the aspen, was a bit different. Also, though, with Manitoba maple, which is a really weedy species and gets everywhere. And then when I actually walked the trail down to the river edge, I noticed these linear belts of, first of all, red osier dogwood, and then closer to the river, a lot of river alder. And I thought that sort of formed a rather distinct community, which probably gets flooded during seasons of high water. I did see disturbance, and I knew from Kelly that some gravel extraction had taken place at one point before it was ceased. And you can see some sort of gouged out hollows, dugouts, and you can see some berms. But Kelly has informed me just now that most of the upland areas are the natural sort of sides of the valley, as it were. So surrounding the bottomlands. The disturbance does affect the flora. As I go through this presentation, you'll see I refer a lot to colonizing species. And one real surprise was how much Canada violet there was there, which is really very extensively colonizing the muddy, leaf-littered forest floor under the balsam poplar and the Manitoba maple. So I think most people can distinguish between aspen poplar and balsam poplar. The easiest way to tell is to look at the leaves. The leaves are large and oval and pointed in balsam poplar, and they're also whitish or brownish underneath, whereas the leaves of aspen, you can see, are smaller, more triangular, green on both sides. And of course, it's called trembling aspen because it has this leaf stalk that's flattened, enabling the leaf to twist readily in the breeze. The poplars have male and female flowers on separate sexes. So there are male plants and female plants, and the flowers are in catkins. They will be gone, I think. There may be some. There will be some signs of the female fruiting catkins on the balsam poplar because they tend to hang on a bit and they also drop to the ground by June. But right now, both trees are finished flowering and are developing fruit. These females are. And of course, it's well known that they reproduce vegetatively, both of them by suckers, which are shoots growing up from lateral roots, forming these clones of genetically identical individuals with the same genes also as the parent trees. So our main, I'm trying to move on here. Okay. Everybody can recognize white spruce, so I'm not going to dwell on this. I mentioned that there is a sort of a complete forest of white spruce in the bottomlands, extending for considerable distance along the main trail. And I've mentioned the river alder along the river as is appropriate. This is a member of the birch family. It has these simple leaves, which are toothed and rather prominently veined, which is characteristic of all members of the birch family. These sort of brownish, rather shiny trunks with little white horizontal dashes on them that are called lenticels. And it's a catkin producer. These are the male catkins, drooping male catkins. with a tiny cluster of tiny flowers, and the female flower is also a very reduced catkin, which will become a brown cone. And that's probably the easiest way to recognize an alder, which is also a very spreading small shrub or small tree, by the presence of these woody cones, not strictly cones, but woody fruiting bodies that stay on the tree. A second member of the birch family is the white birch, which could be one of two species in the ladyflower garden forest, either the Alaskan birch or the paper birch. And I haven't actually checked which of the two it is. In fact, both species could be present, but given the fact that where it occurs in moister habitats, it's most likely to be the Alaskan birch. These are the male catkins, and these slender things are the female catkins, which will get a lot fatter and turn brown as the seeds develop. Again, simple toothed leaves. I'm going to skip over this quickly. Green ash was listed in the lists we got from the plots, but I haven't actually seen any. It does occur in the river valley, but it is really an escape from city plantings because it's mainly planted in city parks and along boulevards. It has compound pinnate leaves, pinnate meaning these pairs of leaflets, opposite pairs of leaflets with a terminal leaflet. So just be aware if you see anything like that. I very much doubt you will see a mature tree with this narrowly grooved bark. But we can be on the lookout for that. Definitely present and very abundant is Manitoba maple, which, as you probably know, is an introduced tree. It is native to North America, and as its name suggests, Manitoba maple, actually in the States it's called box elder. But it is not considered native to this far north in Alberta, and basically it's around because it has escaped from the gardens. It was a popular garden tree, very fast growing tree, quickly giving some shade. And it's escaped into the river valley because it really likes these moist sites. But it's also very weedy, capable of growing almost anywhere in dry soils as well. My neighbor has a female tree behind me, and I root out lots of Manitoba seedlings, Manitoba maple seedlings every year. Again, sexes are on different trees. This is a cluster of male stamens, very attractive. It's already flowered, so these are passed. And the female flowers are a lot less showy and have these large green stigmas. And the fruits turn into these paired winged seeds called samaras. So note the pinnate leaves again, 3 to 5 leaflets per main leaf. And I think everybody will, a pale trunk, not deeply furrowed, everybody will be able to recognize that even as saplings. Another non-native, I didn't see any very mature trees, but there are some saplings certainly. Compound pinnate leaves. Again, a garden escape, no doubt brought into the natural forest by birds. I did see a couple of small plants that I thought were common buckthorn, but no well-developed trees with this flaky bark that you see where it's quite abundant, such as at Dawson Park and Kinnaird Ravine, and Rocky will be very familiar with this tree. It's non-native. It has allelopathic qualities, which means it puts out chemicals from its roots, which discourage the growth of other nearby plants. And I would suggest, in terms of management, that any plants that are found are removed as soon as possible. The black berries are characteristic. The flowers are tiny green things. And this plant sticks out because it is in leaf very late into the fall. So when the other trees have lost their leaves, this one is still showing leaves. So it tends to show itself up at that point. I didn't find any buckbrush or western snowberry, although it's a very common shrub, particularly in more open areas. So I won't spend too more time explaining that, but its relative in the Symphoricarpus genus is snowberry, and it is extremely common. I took this picture on Saturday of this slender shrub with these paired oval leaves. It does have flowers that look a bit like this, not quite as big, belonging to the buckbrush, but it doesn't have nearly as many berries as the buckbrush. It just has these odd white berries, hence the name. So that's almost certain to be in the plot. I forgot to mention that I've checked off with this orange check mark those plants that I saw on Saturday so verifying the list. I didn't see bracted honeysuckle. I added this in because it can be a common shrub in moist forests. Easy to identify with these large opposite leaves and these, when in flower, with these tubular yellow twin flowers, and very, very distinctive and attractive fruits. But no more on that. I'm not sure if it's actually there. Similarly with twining honeysuckle, in the same honeysuckle family, again with opposite leaves and so on. I included it because it's common in our woods. I didn't actually see any in the forest, and it does tend to climb up vegetation, so you can look for it at sort of heights. If it doesn't find any support amongst the other vegetation, it can actually form quite extensive patches on the ground as it scrambles over the ground. So it can be looked for, but I don't know that it's actually there. Nor did I see any Canada buffalo berry, but this is a common forest species, as a sort of medium-sized shrub. It's in the Oleaster family, and this family is characterized by having these rather strange, flat, scaly-like hairs, which in Canada buffalo berry are brown, and they're on the undersides of the leaves, along the twigs, and even on the flowers, giving it this sort of brownish, scurfy appearance. Separate sexes on separate plants. This is the male plant with tiny yellow flowers. It's already flowered. It's one of the earliest flowering shrubs. These are the female flowers with a little stigma sticking out, and these are the ones that will produce the red berries in June or July. So that is to be looked for. It's certainly to be expected, but I didn't actually see it. I think it was on the list, though. Now, it was rather strange because I didn't see either of these species, and it's particularly strange because this one, northern gooseberry, is really common in our forests. It's not a bushy thing. It has these sort of fairly long, separate stems, and it often sort of climbs against other tree trunks or vegetation or something. But I did not see it, even though it would very much be expected. I should say that all the gooseberries and currants are in a single genus, the ryeberries, in the gooseberry family. And generally, we refer to the gooseberries as those plants that have prickles along the stem, and the currants as those that are lacking in prickles. So, but botanically, they are really, extremely similar to be in the same genus. But I did see the swamp currants. Most of our ryeberry species, in fact, all of our ryeberry species tend to have these simple but deeply lobed leaves, and often they're three-lobed. And the leaf in the swamp currant is quite matte, so not shiny as in the skunk currant, and sort of has this crinkled appearance. And I did see several shoots of that. It has these long sprays of pinkish flowers, which tend to hang around for a long time, and they tend to fade, and they really confuse the people doing the May count because they still think they're in flower, but in fact, when you look at the stamens, you know, they're quite spent. It's a low shrub and a very early flower, so it's already flowering and fading now. I did not see any skunk currant. That one's easier to tell because if you crush the leaves, it has this musky odor due to the presence of glands. You can see the glands on the fruit here. And that would be in moist spots. So if it was wet in those bottomlands, it could occur, but I haven't seen it. And neither of these two species either, northern blackcurrant with the white flowers and these sprays of yellow flowers. American blackcurrant actually is quite an attractive shrub. And best place to see that is Wagner Natural Area, which has tons of it. There's a huge amount of Saskatoon. I did see some on the upper slopes as I was walking down towards the house, and also coming up one of the side trails mid slope. So it does prefer the drier ground. It's extremely common in our river valley on the embankments. Easy to spot when it's in flower, of course, because of these narrow petals and these sort of rhombic shaped leaves, which are broader towards the tip. It's a little bit hairy. And of course, we're pretty much all familiar with these sort of blue fruits with a bloom on them. Round-leaved hawthorn I threw in because it does occur in the Edmonton area, but I didn't see it in the forest, so we'll ignore that for the time being. And surprisingly, I didn't find any pincherry on those dry slopes. That too is just finishing flowering right now. Rather more delicate, more spindly plant than the chokecherry, which is extremely common at in the Lady Flower Gardens forest. Not only well-developed shrubs, but also it's forming a ground cover under the trees. At this time of year, there's a tremendous amount of leaf litter, and you can really see where that has been overtaken by greenery. This is because it can sucker, it can form new shoots either from the base of the plant or send up shoots from the creeping roots, and this enables it to form this sort of forest floor covering. So you will undoubtedly come across this in the plots. The leaves are oblong shaped, quite shiny and hard, and the flowers are in these drooping sprays, which of course will become the black chokecherries that we're familiar with. I should mention, of course, that both the Saskatoon and the chokecherry are members of the rose family, so they have little miniature rose flowers, albeit much smaller, of course, than the rose itself. I did see one sort of shoot sticking up that had black knot fungus on it. And that, as you probably all know, is a common fungal disease of chokecherry. I didn't see very much despite the abundance of chokecherries. So I would recommend that if you see any, you actually it might be worthwhile trying to get rid of it before it does spread. The roses, okay, two possibilities, the prickly wild rose and the common wild rose. There are some sort of technical characters to distinguish the two, prickles, where they're located and so on. But I generally go, first of all, by habitat. The prickly wild rose is much more a forest species than the common wild rose, which tends to be more a thicket, an edge, and a pasture or or prairie grassland species. Um, the, both have these pinnate leaves again with these paired leaflets, but they're larger and fewer in the prickly wild rose uh, than in uh, than in the common wild rose, which has more numerous smaller leaflets. If you happen to see the fruits developing the hips, that is a helpful character because they're more flask-shaped with this constriction just below the flower in the prickly wild rose, and they're much more round and smaller in the common wild rose. And I'm suspecting that probably common wild rose is much the commoner in the forest, um, or at least it would be the ones that you see in the drier survey plots. But if in doubt, I think you could just say Rosa SP period, which will indicate that you've identified it genus, but not you're not sure which of the two species it is. I did see a bit of cotoneaster, shiny cotoneaster in the forest, not much. Again, this is an ornamental species that's being carried in by birds. Simple leaves, if there are fruits there, should be easy enough to identify. I did not see any crab apples, although they're fairly frequent elsewhere in the river valley as garden escapes. There's quite a bit of beaked hazelnut, and this is particularly common on the drier slopes. It's our third member of the birch family, so it has flowers in catkins with both sexes on the same plant. So these are the males just about to shed pollen, and these already receptive red stigmas, which will turn, amazingly enough, into these hazelnuts, which can be single or double, or I've even seen clusters of 3 or 4 in a good year. The leaves are the simple tooth birch type leaves, and could be possibly confused in the right now for birch leaves, but they expand as they mature, become much larger, and they're soft to the touch. So I often just sort of feel a leaf and think, okay, yes, that's beaked hazelnut. It's always a shrub, never a tree. This again is a shrub that's easy to identify because of its red stems. It's a sort of rather branchy shrub, medium to tall. Some of the stems actually in age can turn pale green or even whitish, but a healthy shrub will have these red stems, which of course is why it's so frequently grown in gardens as an ornamental. The leaves are oval, long oval and opposite, and the flowers consist of these clusters of very small flowers, which will become these white berries later on. I'll just comment that red osier dogwood in the genus Cornus has another very common relative, which is more herbaceous, and that's the bunchberry, which is a very common forest species, and I could have included it. But I actually did not see any in Ladyflower garden forest, and I think that's a little surprising. May just be a question of the fact that it never got there, but it is a surprising omission. Of course, it might be there and I just never saw it, but it's certainly not abundant. Its flowers are actually extremely similar to its relative, which is the shrub. And again, I saw this particularly along the trail close to the river and along sort of just set back from the river bank. I did see elderberry, and I actually took this picture on Saturday. And this, I wondered if this is what people may have confused with the green ash, because it has rather similar pinnate leaves, except that they're a lot softer to the touch, and they're definitely toothed in the red elderberry. This, I suspect, is not a totally native plant. I think it's spread by birds from from horticultural plantings, but I can't be absolutely certain of that. And certainly it does occur in natural forest situations. It will be flowering very shortly, and then of course the red elderberries that give it its name will appear later on. Um, this is our second member of the Oleaster family. The first one being, of course, our Canada buffalo berry, and as I mentioned, it will have these scale-like coverings to the leaves, the twigs, and the flowers and fruits. But instead of being brown, as in Canada buffalo berry, they're silver, giving it its alternative name, silverberry. Most of us call it wolf willow. And probably most people are familiar with this. The flowers appear in June and are beautifully fragrant. I love the smell, some people don't. This occurs in small quantities along the river edge at Lady Flower Garden. Raspberry. I don't like this plant. There's quite a bit of it in the forest. To me, it's always a sign of disturbance. It tends to, and the reason I don't like it is because it can form these thickets, which crowd out and monopolize the ground space and the resources, and preclude a more diverse forest flora. It's particularly common in the sort of drier areas, and I'm also finding it in grasslands as well. So I don't like to see it, but I think there's too much of it there to be properly controlled. To control it, I would, simply cut it down. Most people, of course, think it's quite natural. And this is the interesting thing. There are probably two varieties present. This one, subspecies strigosus, would be a natural variety. But I suspect that in the, that's very strange, in these colonizing situations, that it is in fact a European variety that's come in and that is much more aggressive. Anyway, so much for my dislike of raspberries. This is a native raspberry, the dewberry. It is a trailing plant that runs along the forest floor. It does produce these fruits that are, look like typical raspberries, these collection of drupelets. This will be found in the moister bottomlands, I think. It's often found in mixed woods. That is a mixture of the poplars and white spruce, not so much in purely deciduous forests. We have two viburnums, the lowbush, which is an appropriate name because it doesn't get very tall, and the high bush, which is a tall, sprawling shrub. The high bush being much the more common in the forest here. Both of them have these simple leaves that are three-lobed, but they are really sharply three-lobed in the high bush cranberry. I don't think you'll mistake the two at all. They're really not superficially alike. The high bush cranberry can also be recognized by the very pale stems, which tend to spread in every direction. And of course, most people can recognize it when it's in fruit. The flowers are similar in both species, but they're much more showy in the high bush cranberry because this outer ring of flowers actually are sterile and they're just there for show. They just have big petals. The functional flowers are these much smaller ones in the center. So that should appear in the high bush should appear in the study plots. I'm not going to spend much time on willows. As I mentioned, it's a big group or genus of species, and although the genus itself is fairly easy to recognize, they all have these, or mostly have these long, narrow leaves. Distinguishing the species within the genus can be quite difficult. I thought these were likely to be found, and I, in fact, did not see them. This is the basket willow, which is mainly a a wet meadow species, and a pussy willow, which is a bit more of an upland species and is pretty common. But I haven't seen them. I will be on the lookout for them in June. Nor did I see the beech willow, which is really quite common in our woodlands. It's more an upland as opposed to a wetland-loving species, but I didn't happen to see it on Saturday. But it was, I think, on the list. But I did see this willow, hungry willow, or Salix famelica. It was formerly known as yellow willow, Salix lutea. They decided that Salix lutea was actually a different species. But it's a good name because its branches and twigs are very pale. It's very much a species that grows along watercourses. So I actually found a few specimens along the edge of the river, but nowhere else. So if anyone has a plot close to the river, it's a possibility, but I don't think you'll come across it in the interior. And also by the river edge, one example of Pacific willow, which is a beautiful willow with these large, glossy, deep green leaves. Of course, most people are probably familiar with the fruiting catkins of willows. It's in the willow family, as it are the poplars. So again, a similar flower structure with very small flowers that produce capsules that then split open to release all these seeds, which have attached to them these clusters of white hairs, which aid in wind dispersal. So moving on to the herbaceous plants, I did see some palmate leaf coltsfoot. This is a plant that can be quite abundant along the forest floor, spreading by rhizomes. In the spring, if there's sufficient light, it will produce these flower heads. It's a member of the Asteraceae. So the Asteraceae flowers consist of very small flowers called florets that are grouped into these heads, which is surrounded by a ring of green bracts called an involucre. And these will then, again, there's some separation of male and female plants, with some of the plants having an abundance of male-only florets and others having florets with the female pistils, which will turn into these seeds, again, with a cluster of white hairs called a pappus, which will aid in wind dispersal. Now, I didn't see these two species, arrowleaf coltsfoot or vineleaf coltsfoot, but I did see some specimens of this, and that's logical because this is the predominantly forest species. This one tends to occur in wet areas, in wetlands and ditches and so on. And the vineleaf coltsfoot, also to some extent a forest species. It's sort of a hybrid of these two species. I said far too much on these already. Canada anemone in the buttercup family. Just going back, you see there is some similarity in the leaves, but notice the leaves of coltsfoot are sort of, they're lobed, but they're not sharply lobed, wider towards the tip, whereas the leaves of Canada anemone are really sort of sharply divided. So a member of the buttercup family with these very simple flowers, a cluster of a ring of stamens, and then in the center, the cluster of pistils, that's the stigma, style, and ovary, that will produce the fruiting head, and each one of these is an achene or a separate fruit. You can see the leaves below forming this sort of ring below the flower stalk. So that will be flowering shortly, early June. And I did see some examples of that. Its relative is quite different because the Canada anemone tends to form a ground cover, whereas these are single plants with a fairly sort of a 30 centimeter tall flowering stalk, but similar leaves look, deeply divided and toothed. Forming this cluster of pistils in the middle will form a sort of somewhat elongated flower head, fruiting head, sorry, with the achenes having a lot of hair attached to them, which again probably aids in wind dispersal, but they tend to stick around through the winter, as you can see from this plant. So this one is present. The horsetails. They are vascular plants, but they're not flowering plants. So far, we've considered only flowering plants. They reproduce by spores and by underground rhizomes too, forming often extensive patches. The spores are produced in these cone-like structures on these stems, which completely lacks chlorophyll in this particular species. And the leaves are arranged in whorls, so giving, I suppose, the impression of a horse's tail. I would expect both to be present, this one especially near the river, but in fact, I just saw this one, not looking as advanced as this by any means, in the forest last Saturday. So that is likely to occur in the plots. Horsetail, where it occurs, is usually quite abundant. And this is an example of a key, which I mentioned earlier on. I'm not going to spend time going into this, but you see, you choose between contrasting statements about the plant, and you move on to the next number, and so you go on until you arrive at a species name. So that's how keys work. And as I say, a much more precise way of actually, identifying the plant species. Canada violet, an easy one to recognize, I think. It has very large leaves for a violet. They're heart-shaped with this deep sinus. These rather large, whitish, pinkish tinged flowers. And as I mentioned at the beginning, very, very abundant, colonizing the bottomlands. So that will be easy to see, and maybe not so common in the drier spots. But I hope we do have some plots in those bottomlands areas. And I also spotted one or two plants of the kidney leaf violet, which will not be in flower in June. There may be a few remnant flowers of the Canada violet, but this has these definitely kidney-shaped leaves, which become larger, and it will produce more leaves as the season goes on. But it is still a fairly diminutive ground-hugging plant. So both those are present. Dandelions need no explanation, mainly occurring along the trails. I didn't see too many of them, fortunately, but of course, situation changes rapidly. I see now whole grassy areas covered with yellow dandelions. This is very much a forest herb. It's a monocotyledon in the lily family, and it has these oval paired opposite leaves. It's a fairly low herb, rather delicate, with these twin bell-like flowers, which will become these fruits. Actually, there's usually 3 flowers together, and they become these clusters of 3 fruits. And the fruits have a sort of a rough texture, almost a velvety texture, hence the name of the flower. The fairy bells, of course, from the flowers, and the rough fruited from the fruits themselves. So I saw 1 or 2 of those. Doesn't seem to be very common, but should come across it. And another forest species, a native forest species, the red and white baneberry. This is a very leafy plant. It has these big leaves that are divided into 3 segments, 3 leaflets, which are again divided into 3. And so the result is quite an expanse of foliage. Flowers are in these white clusters, small white flowers. Should be flowering any time now. And most characteristic are these really shiny berries that develop from those flower clusters. And they can be red or they can be white, whichever, it's regarded as a single species. While sarsaparilla can be a major ground cover in places, I didn't see a lot of it in the forest. It spreads by rhizomes, hence its ability to form a sort of more continuous ground cover. Typical forest species in that it has these large leaves divided again into 3 to 5 leaflets. Large leaves obviously being an advantage in shady situations as catching maximum sunlight. And the flowers come up on these separate stalks, small clusters of white flowers, which will turn into black berries later on. Not necessarily very easy to spot, they really hide under the foliage. I did see 1 or 2 plants of that. It tends to be a species that likes mixed woods again. You can see pine needles on the ground here. So it might not be that common in Lady Flower Gardens forest. This is a favorite of photographers. It's a very low growing plant, very delicate, diminutive plant. It's much photographed because of its really attractive flowers with these sort of cone-like petals sticking out. It's called mitowort and bishop's cap because the fruits are the shape, the capsule is the shape of a bishop's cap, and they open out to form this platform to which these black seeds are attached. And when raindrops fall on this platform and the seeds are ripe, the raindrops knock off the seeds, and so it's rain dispersed, if you like. It's a member of the saxifrage family, and saxifrages tend to have these rounded leaves with these sort of smooth scalloped edges or crenulations, very characteristic of that of the whole family, in fact. Another monocotyledon. This used to be in the lily family, now but in the asparagus family. Starflowered false Solomon seal. Again, a colony former, will be quite common. You can see why it's called star-flowered, and it produces berries that eventually turn this deep wine red. So that's one to be aware of, to recognize. And its relative, also a myanthemum in the same genus, myanthemum, doesn't look much like it at all. It has these it's a much lower plant with these wider oval leaves and an erect spike of rather similar white flowers, except these only have 4 tepals, a single ring of petal-like segments, whereas the star-flowered Solomon seal has 6. So that is around. It likes the drier ground, so in the uplands. This very attractive, really robust herb, tall lungwort, with these deep green leaves that are rough to the touch, as is common in the borage family. Very easy to identify it if it's in flower. It has these bell-like flowers which start out pink and mature to blue. But it should be recognizable. In June, there will be remnants of flowers. It should be recognized as such. The only confusing thing is that it produces basal leaves, which are much broader. I should have included a photo than these sort of rather narrow lanceolate leaves that are shown on the flowering stems. So sometimes people don't relate the basal leaves to the stem leaves. I just came across this small flowered crowfoot on the trail on Saturday. It's a buttercup that, buttercup crowfoot are interchangeable, that likes moist sites and particularly, I think, trails. It is one of a small group of buttercups that have different basal leaves from the stem leaves. So these basal leaves are these rounded, almost saxifrage-like leaves, and the stem leaves are divided into these narrow segments. So that's a good, easy key character to look for if you are actually keying out the buttercups. Very small flowers, very small buttercup-like flowers. Yes, this is another a delicate, low-growing herb, that perennial herb, native, that is in the pink family. It has these pairs of opposite leaves with these blunt tips and these delicate white flowers on these very sort of flimsy flower stalks. It's a member of the pink family. It could be overlooked if there's only one or two plants, because it really doesn't have a lot of biomass, but it does tend to form patches on the forest floor, and when it's in flower, it will be quite noticeable. And I saw that in the in that expanse of white spruce forest along the main trail. Veiny meadow rue. This is another colonizer of their ground, both in forests and in meadows. It's a member of the buttercup family, although to look at the flowers, you would not guess that. It has compound leaves divided into leaflets, which are again low, and it's called veiny meadow rue because the veins are very prominent underneath, not on top. It has its male and female flowers on separate plants, and they grow, although the green rosette is fairly low to the ground, the flower stalks are quite tall, and this is a male plant with drooping stamens, and this is a female plant with all these red, bright stigmas ready to catch the pollen, and those will produce fruits which are again called achenes. I should have mentioned perhaps that achenes are single-seeded fruits. They're very, very simple fruits produced in many families, and usually produced in large numbers together in a fruiting head. So that is fairly common and will be seen. Right, the pea family. The cream-colored vetchling, I did see evidence of. It's just beginning to sort of develop its leaves now. In flower, these two relatives are obviously easy to tell apart because this has these fairly dense clusters of purple flowers, and the cream-colored vetchling is more loosely flowered with white flowers. But if the flowers are not present, you have to look at the leaves, which are more oval. These are compound pinnate leaves with pairs of leaflets, which are more oval in the cream-colored vetchling and narrower in the purple pea vine. And the other characteristic is that they have little appendages called stipules at the base of the leaf, which are larger and more rounded in the cream-colored vetchling, and almost pointed like arrows, and much smaller in the purple pea vine. That's a bit technical, and hopefully you will be able to recognize the two plants. Another character is that the foliage tends to be sort of bluish green in the cream-colored vetchling, but bright green in purple pea vine. And as you know, as members of the pea family, they will be fixing nitrogen, gaseous nitrogen in the soil. The other pea family member is the American vetch, which is something of a climbing plant. It has these deep purple or blue flowers in racines, in stalk spikes. It produces tendrils. I should have mentioned actually that both these vetchlings or pea vines have the terminal pair of leaflets modified into these thin threads that are sensitive to the touch and can curl around other vegetation, and this helps the plants scramble up, so they don't invest a lot of structure in sort of rigid stems, but they rely on other plants for support. And it's the same with American vetch. It also produces tendrils at the ends of these compound leaves. I did not see any tufted vetch there, which is a good thing, because the tufted vetch is very invasive. It's non-native, whereas American vetch is native. If anyone sees any, I would recommend pulling it out immediately. It's very invasive in Edmonton areas, and extremely difficult to get rid of once established. So something to be on the lookout for and to remove if possible. Of the bed straws, this one actually is a weedy one, and it was on the list, surprisingly. I wonder if it was a mis-ID, because it really is a plant of disturbed gardens and not really forest areas. And this is a wetland species, so I'm discounting that. But both the northern bedstraw and the sweet-scented bedstraw are present. This one being much more an open area species, so also in meadows, but forest edges and inside forests. And this sweet-scented one being very much a forest species, and I could see clumps of the leaves. It wasn't yet in flower in the bottomlands, particularly on Saturday. This tends to have these sort of darker green leaves, and the leaves, which are simple, are attached at one point on the stem, 4 of them together, and that forms what's called a whorl, W-H-O-R-L. So 4 leaves make a whorl in the northern bedstraw, whereas this sweet-scented has 6 leaves in the whorl at the attachment of the stem or the node. It's also much brighter green. It tends to sprawl much more when it's in flower. So I don't think there'll be any difficulty distinguishing those 2 species, although they are related. And another example of how you could separate out those 4 galium or bedstraw species if you had them. I won't take time to go into that. Cow parsnip is present there, a very tall plant with large 3 leafleted large leaves, and this flat top cluster of flowers, which are typical of the carrot family. So that is always nice to see as a plant of moist forests. There are clovers in the forest. I think the all-site clover was the one that was listed in the species list for the Bioblitzes. It's possible that all 3 occur. I saw a clover along a trail that I thought was most likely the white or Dutch clover. It's a lower ground-hugging, more creeping plant. But the all-site clover is also very likely because it's a plant of disturbed ground. It's more robust than the white clover, and the flowers, these are all pea flowers, by the way, all clustered together into these heads. The flowers tend to have a pinkish tinge, whereas the white clover will be almost exclusively white. And of course, the red clover has bigger heads, and in flower is unmistakable. Common pink wintergreen is a common forest species, and yet I did not actually see any there. And I should have been able to recognize it, because these round leaves that come out in these clusters, these are young leaves and quite small. The older leaves are larger, but still very distinctly round, are evergreen. So they will be present in the spring, but I did not see any. And then, of course, later on in late June or July, the plant sends up its flowering stem with these reflexed pink, very, very characteristic flowers. That used to be in its own family called the Pyrrolaceae, but was actually placed in the heath family, though. That's the one with Labrador tea and the blueberries and so on. And you would probably never guess that they're actually closely related to the heath plants. So yeah, I'll certainly be on the lookout for that in June, because it is to be expected, especially in the slightly drier areas of the forest. Leafy spurge was on the list, I believe, but I did not see any, and that's just great because it's a noxious weed, pretty easy to recognize if you come across it. Any infestation should be removed as quickly as possible. The geums, I didn't see, but are to be expected. They are moist forest floor species. They're in the rose family, and they have these small yellow flowers that are a bit reminiscent of potentillas, if you're familiar with, garden potentillas, or even the native ones. The two species are distinguished mainly by this shape of this terminal leaflet on the compound leaf, which is wedge-shaped in yellow avens and much more rounded and heart-shaped in the large-leaved avens. And since the leaves are almost present all the time, it should be possible to distinguish those two species, except maybe when they're very young. I know we had some trouble this summer deciding which of the two species it was, but hopefully they will be typical leaves. Spreading dogbane is another sort of weedy. It's native, but it's a colonizer of dry ground, especially sandy soils. It has these opposite oval leaves and these nice sort of pinkish bell-shaped flowers in clusters, which will turn into these very narrow, elongate, wine red pods if fertilized. I didn't see any on Saturday, but it could well be there. Also, we should be on the lookout for this one, Indian hemp, a relative. They're both Apocyneums. But this actually is really a river species, and Rocky's familiar with this from Dawson Park. It's not nearly as attractive because the flowers are very narrow and sort of almost closed up. It does have these bigger oval leaves and so on, similar fruiting pods. But that may occur along the river edge if we're sort of including that as part of the forest. Common plantain, found only along the moist trails. I didn't see a lot of it. Fireweed, we're pretty much all familiar with that. Notice the long pods that are formed with containing these tiny seeds with their little attached hairs for wind dispersal. And I just happened to see a small patch of this plant on Saturday. This, believe it or not, is in the fireweed family, so the same family, Onagraceae, but quite different in appearance and habit. It's a low-growing plant, often forming extensive patches by means of a thick rhizome at the base that sends out these additional plants. The leaves are paired and toothed, are much broader than, of course, in the narrow leaves of the fireweed. And it has these very small white flowers, which only have 2 petals instead of the 4 petals that you see in the fireweed. So not a very attractive plant, but quite common in moist forest areas. Nettles were already showing themselves. No flowers, of course, it flowers later on, but it was clearly present, and the stinging hairs are underneath these very definitely toothed and veined leaves, so it's to be avoided with handling. Agrimony, a member of the rose family, is a common forest species, particularly in the more open areas. It has these yellow, somewhat rose-like flowers in the spike. It has pinnate divided leaves. You can't see them too well here. And most distinctive of all, the fruiting spikes, which have these cone-shaped fruits with these sort of bent over hairs at the top, which cling to animal fur and clothing, thereby aiding the plant's dispersal. And I did see rosettes of this plant, so pinnate leaves, a bit like those geums that you saw already on the forest floor. But surprisingly, in rather moisture areas than I would expect. Yarrow. This is another spreading, rather weedy plant. This species, Achillea borealis, is considered to be native, and I'm not even sure this picture is actually of it, because there is a related species called Achillea millifolium, meaning 1,000 leaves, and that refers to these very finely divided feathery leaves, which you will see much more often than you will see the flower heads. And sometimes that sort of confuses people. It is a member of the aster family, so the flowers are grouped into these heads, and these tiny little things in the middle are all distinct florets, which will produce seeds. And that again tends to frequent the drier areas. Burdock, well, I did see the leaves of that. Has these huge leaves to start off with, a huge rosette of leaves, and then it sends up this very tall flower stalk with these sort of spiky heads on them. It's an aster family member. So these are the florets in the middle, and this is a group of bracts that form a cup or an involucre. And there could be two species there. To tell them apart, you need to be able to see these involucres, either in flower or fruit. If they don't have any hairs, they're the common burdock. If they do have this spidery, whitish web of hairs, they are the woolly burdock. And I'm not sure, I think it was the common one that was recorded. It's a weed, of course, so not one to be welcomed. But Rocky's very familiar with this plant from Dawson Park, so we know it can grow in forests. This one, of course, is shown in the open area. Thankfully, I did not see any Canada thistle, and hopefully there isn't much there. I think we can all recognize that. It is a noxious weed. I would recommend strenuous efforts to get rid of it if it does appear. The asters used to be in the genus Aster, but a good number of them are placed in a genus called Cynthia trichum. I just saw the Lindley's aster there, which is the typical woodland species. A lot of them occur in meadows or in wetland areas. But this one is quite faithful to a woodland habitat. It has these sort of pointed leaves, and this, you can only just see it, I think. The PTO is what we call winged, with the blade extending a bit down the flower stalk and to the junction with the stem, purplish stem. I did see some leaves of this. The composites, or the asters, are all, aster family members are all late flowering plants, but they've already sent up their, produced their shoots of leaves. So that enables us to spot most of them at this early time of the season. Except I did not see the leaves of showy aster, although I think it was recorded on the list. This is a big-leaved aster, actually been put into another genus Eurybia, but unmistakable when it's in flower, more a forest edge species than an interior forest species. Um, I added this because we do get this in our forests, certainly in Edmonton, and it confuses a lot of people. Uh, you know, it doesn't seem to be a very well-known plant, although it is reasonably common. It's the ragworts or the senecio always have these yellow flowers. This is the plant in fruit with this pappus of hairs attached to the 18 clusters. And ragwort can be confused with tansy, but most people, I think, are, because of the leaves are somewhat similar. Just look at the difference again. Sort of much broader leaflets in the cut-leaf ragwort, and narrower and toothed in tansy. But of course, when tansy is in flower, these yellow buttons are absolutely unmistakable, very easily recognized. A very undesirable noxious weed, because it can spread and form these extensive patches by means of these rhizomes. And I've seen wetland shores that are absolutely covered with tansy. And unfortunately, nobody seems to be in a hurry to kind of reduce its numbers. The goldenrods, how are we doing for time? Yes, there's 3 species in what is called a Canada goldenrod complex. These are all tall, leafy goldenrods with these sprays of flower heads, composite flower heads, consisting of these yellow florets. And at least 2 of them, the tall goldenrod and the elegant goldenrod, are quite difficult to tell apart. The third one, late goldenrod, is easier because it is completely hairless, unlike the other 2, and it has these purplish stems that have this whitish bloom on them. And this is good because this actually is the forest species. The other 2 species tend to occur in grasslands, more open areas, although they could certainly be possible in some of those fringe areas in the lady flower garden forest. So I did see this. It's producing shoots at the moment, although it won't bloom until probably August. This is the elegant goldenrod for contrast on this side, but this is the one we're probably going to find. I'm not going to go into grass morphology because we're really getting short of time. I just quickly want to mention a few grasses. We will come across smooth brome. It's everywhere, even in forests, although I didn't fortunately see much of it in those moist bottomlands. I just saw a lot of leaf litter, which is probably, it just smothers the brome. It's a tall growing, broad-leaved grass. It was brought in as, it's non-native, it was brought in as a forage species at the beginning of the century, and it is spread everywhere. And it's really the ecologist's nemesis, because it's really impossible to get out of native grassland plantings and even forested areas. It's easy to distinguish among other broadleaf grasses because it has a sort of crimping, and I'm sure you can't see it, but a crimping of the leaves, a sort of slight narrowing which forms an M shape. The shoots are coming up all over now, so if you just wander into, along the road or into the river valley, you will see the green shoots of this grass coming up. And this, of course, is what the panicle, the flowering head, looks like, with these spikelets with narrow individual florets in them, and these are the stamens that are hanging out. Marsh reedgrass is another common grass of wetland edges, but also moist forests. It's a fairly broad bladed grass as well, with a somewhat similar panicle to brome grass. And it forms extensive patches, but I did not actually see any in the forest. And it, we'll have to see later on if we can actually find any of that. I think it was listed in the list, that's why I included it. Kentucky bluegrass is almost certain to be there, but I have to confess that the grass I saw growing along the trails, I could not actually tell what it was. And I should have looked because all the bluegrasses or the POA species have what's called a boat-shaped or a keeled tip to the leaf blade, which certainly gives you the genus POA, not of course the species. So I should have checked, but I did forget. We'll look at those later. Foul bluegrass, another POA I didn't see. It would be in moist areas maybe, but also open. So it likely, quite possible it doesn't occur there. White green mountain rice is a forest species. It's a clump grass, although the clump is rather sprawly with the leaves spreading out. It has these single spikes, and it's actually coming into flower right now. It's one of the earliest flowering grasses. And it's called white grain mountain rice because I'm not sure about the mountain, but the grains, that is the fruiting body, do look like sort of white pearls of rice. I did see one plant, there could have been more. It likes these sort of drier, hilled areas, well-drained ground. So there should be some scope for it, but I didn't see a lot on Saturday. Marsh reedgrass, another of the plants that I hate, that like the raspberry may consist of native and non-native populations, with the non-native ones being the aggressive ones that form these extensive colonies, particularly along wetland edges, but also in moist areas in forests, particularly if you've got a low-lying area in a forest, which actually creates a bit of a wetland, then you will get a lot of green canary grass. And I did see it at the river's edge, so hence the orange check mark. Again, sort of a bit similar, I suppose, to brome. And the thing to notice about this grass is that it's really quite attractive when it's in flower with this rather erect but spreading panicle, but it closes up to like a cylindrical panicle once it's flowered. So it has these sort of plume-like fruiting heads, which make it fairly easy to distinguish. Now the sedges. So there are just about 3 sedges there that I could see. This one I've already mentioned, the bristle. Well, maybe I did mention it during the, maybe I mentioned it before the illustration started. Bristle leaf sedge, Carex hibernia, is present in the forest as in quite an abundance. In some of the side trails, it almost formed a soft carpet. It's a very fine leaf sedge. These are the flowering parts. I'm not going to go into sedge flower morphology. It's different from grasses again, and from the more showy flowering plants. But bristleaf sedge is quite uncommon, and I know it from 1 or 2 places elsewhere in the river valley in Edmonton, but it's definitely not one that occurs everywhere. And the population at Lady Flower Garden Forest is the largest population I've ever seen. It's very much a species that likes riverbanks, not necessarily right on the bank. It likes forested areas close to the river. And if you look at the distribution on a distribution map, you'll see it occurs along several of the rivers in Alberta, but most particularly along the mountain rivers. So that is a nice one to know that it occurs there. And as I say, very fine leaves, very, very soft leaves forming these mats. A tough forming sedge that's very common is peck sedge. And this, I will show you a little bit. This is the male spike with some anthers protruding. It's past flowering, well past flowering. And these are the female flowers that have turned into fruits. And the fruits of sedges consist of this outer covering, capsule-like, called a perigonum or perigynium, is how it's spelt. And inside that is the single-seeded achene. And each flower is subtended by these bracts, which are a useful character in identification. And notice how furry these perigina are. There's only a few sedges that are covered with hair, that have the perigina covered with hairs. So that again is a useful character. And this is sort of what the plant looks like. It would of course be mistaken for a grass by most people, but it has a quite distinct flower structure and is in a totally different family called the Cyperaceae or sedge family. And that is present and it's just finished flowering at the moment. It's in the drier areas. Now, this sedge, dewy sedge, the other common one, also tufted, was really abundant along the moist trail. So a slight differentiation in habitat there. And the flowers, as you can see, are the flowers in these spikelets are quite different. It also has these long bristle pointed bracts at the base of a flower cluster. And the whole plant looks greenish, very, very greenish. The bracts subtending the perigina on the female flower cluster are silvery. So the flower cluster tends to have a silvery appearance. And this is a single periginum. I'm grateful to Pat Marlowe for these close-ups because I'm just hopeless at taking close-up pictures of sedges. When in flower, the peck sedge and the dewy sedge will be quite easy to distinguish. If leaves only are present, then it requires a little more experience to distinguish between the two. But generally, the dewy sedge is more clumped, more compact clumped. The peck sedge is more strawy, and there's a slight difference in habitat in that dewy does prefer the moister areas. I should have said when we moved on to the grasses that we were into the graminoid section of the presentation. Graminoids being grasses, sedges, and rushes. So they're vascular plants, they're flowering plants, but they don't have the showy plants that we associate with the roses and the fireweeds and the pinks and so on. They have these small flowers and they're all monocotyledons, which includes the lilies, of course, as opposed to the large number of plant families that fall into the dicotyledons. I didn't see any wire rush, but it would be very likely to come across. It's a sort of a grayish green colonial plant that consists of these single green stalks with the flower clusters attached at the side. It's very resistant to trampling, so you often see it on wet trails. It does like moisture, but I haven't seen it, so that needs to be verified if it's there. On to the ferns, which are a distinct group, and I mentioned already in connection with the horsetails. These are not seed plants. They are vascular plants, but they are not flowering plants, and consequently they're not fruit-bearing plants either. They reproduce by spores. I did come across this plant, I think, in my first visit to the garden some years ago, and so I've included it, but I didn't see it on a recent trip, and it may not be very common or at all common. But the narrow spinnulo shield fern is a more common woodland fern. It starts out as these fiddleheads every year, but some leaves, some fronds do remain over the winter. It's considered to be somewhat evergreen, and then sending up clusters of new fronds from a central point each season. It's spore bearing, so that means the structures that carry the spores are it doesn't mean that, actually, rephrase that. The spore bearing structures are on the underside of the leaves in this particular species. Sometimes they're on more specialized leaves which don't have a photosynthetic function. So that is present, as is the oak fern, which is quite distinct from the narrow spindulose shield fern. As you can see, the leaf compound fronds were divided into three equal segments, which are divided again into these pinnae, these narrow leaflets, which are also divided, so giving a very fern-like appearance. This isn't evergreen, so it sends up these new beautiful fresh green shoots every spring. And that ends the list of plants that I'm going to go through. I just want to show you a couple of resources. This is a book I would recommend. Sorry, it's not quite in focus. Written by two of our local botanists, Derek Johnson and Linda Kershaw, and a couple from BC. I think it's available from Amazon for something like $39.96 or something. This really is a very comprehensive book with lots of pictures, with some simple keys, with plant descriptions, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to, really get into botanizing locally. It went out of print 2-3 years ago when we were running a plant course, and the booksellers, the secondhand booksellers, were selling them for $100. It's now in print again and down to approximately $40. And for the really serious botanists, this is another book, actually the second edition just produced this year by Linda Kershaw and Lorna Allen, both professional botanists. This is just a book of keys, as I say, some of which are easy to use and some of which are difficult depending on the group you're dealing with. So basically that is dictated by nature, but it's a comprehensive list of all the plants occurring in Alberta, and it gives, of course, the Latin names and keys, and it is illustrated, which is quite helpful. So that's actually, sorry, that's the one that's available for $39. Yes, sorry, that's the one that's available for $39.96. The Plants of the Western Forest is available for $20-something from one of the major booksellers. You can just Google them and go online. And I would just remind you that a lot of these plants can be seen online. Wikipedia is a great source, especially if you've got the Latin name, because that will bring you, you will avoid all the nurseries and the sales and things, and come straight to the plain botany. So I definitely advise using online resources. I would just wish everyone good luck who will be taking part in the Bioblitz, and if you're not, just enjoy your spring and take notice of the plants and learn a lot. You can learn a lot that way. We've got good literature, good resources, and it's just a matter of observation, being out in the field of the forest and putting in the time as a hobby. So thank you. And I hope I have bored everybody.
Patsy, thank you so much for such a detailed and fantastic presentation. We were very lucky to have you here to help us go over some of the plants of the new Jubilee old growth forest. It was very excellent. I really learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did as well.